On this episode of The Ryan Vet Show.
Gen Alpha doesn't just consume content, they don't just share it. They can create it instantly with prompts. Now anyone can create, and it's instant. For Gen Alpha, none of this feels new, it feels normal. And yet, what part of being able to create something out of nothing by just speaking a prompt to a machine is normal?
And now, a reading from Ryan Vet's newsletter, Collide.
Gen Alpha turned 13. A look at 13-year-olds through the Generational Prism. The first Gen Alpha teenagers have arrived. There's nothing magical about the number 13. The hypothalamus doesn't decide to release kisspeptin on your 4,745th day of life. And adolescence doesn't arrive on schedule. But 13 is a cultural marker, a rite of passage, the threshold between childhood and the harder work of becoming someone. And it's a useful moment to stop and look around. Gen Alpha is often still talked about as if they're kids, tablets in hand, still learning the alphabet. They're not. The oldest Gen Alphas are turning 13 this year. They're entering the teenage years, which means they're entering identity formation, greater independence, and a particular friction of figuring out who you are in the world that is ever changing. So the right question isn't what Gen Alpha will become. It's this: what kind of world are they entering? To answer that, it helps to look at where we've been. When 13 meant the mall and arcade. When the first Gen Xers turned 13 in 1978, the world still required you to leave your living room to have a social life. When Gen X came home from school, many times no one was there. They were latchkey kids. Independence wasn't curated. It was expected. They figured things out because they had to. Typically, Gen X experienced freedom to do just about whatever they wanted after school, so long as they were home by the time the streetlights came on. Space Invaders had just been released. Without parental supervision and often without explicit permission, Gen Xers would leave their home and head down to the arcade. They stood shoulder to shoulder with other kids, hearing the beeping and laser blasters from the game, quarters in hand, waiting for their turn. Entertainment was the place they went, not a screen that they held. At home, Mork and Mindy and Battlestar Galactica had just been released. Technology was infiltrating the government with the installation of computers in the White House as well. 1978 was a big year in tech. Even more, the Laserdisc had been introduced, which preceded the CD-ROM. The Walkman was around the corner. Digital computer-powered technology was advancing rapidly for the first time, but it was still a tool. It had not permeated into every facet of life. When 13 meant something was changing. By the time the first Millennials turned 13 in 1993, the world felt different. Not fully changed, but changing. You could feel it. The movie Jurassic Park was likely the greatest movie feat since Star Wars. CGI advancement had made dinosaurs look real in a way that nothing had before. Not animated, not imagined, real enough to suspend disbelief. That same year, Doom dropped players into a first-person experience that felt immersive and honestly a little unsettling compared to the pixelated games before it. CNN had been on the air since 1980, so millennials had grown up with the idea of 24-hour news cycles already present. However, by the early to mid-1990s, as millennials were turning into teens, all the major news stations, including MSNBC and Fox, began 24/7 news. Wired magazine launched in 1993, signaling that technology wasn't just hardware anymore, it was becoming culture. Ironic how archaic the term wired would seem in just a few short years. At the same time, about 1 in 10 Americans had a cell phone. PDAs were introduced, and then quietly on April 30th, 1993, something called the World Wide Web was released into the public domain. Most people didn't fully grasp it yet, but something had opened. Millennials grew up in that tension between a world that still felt physical and one that was rapidly becoming digital. You didn't have to live fully online yet, but each day you moved more and more digital. When 13 meant living online. When Gen Z turned 13 in 2010, there was no tension anymore. The shift had already happened. Smartphones were in pockets. Wi-Fi was everywhere. The internet wasn't something you logged into waiting for the dial-up song to play itself out. It was just there. Nearly 3/4 of teens were already using social networking platforms. The Social Network, a film already memorializing the birth of Facebook, came out this same year. Toy Story 3 tugged at millennial nostalgia while Gen Z sat in the theater experiencing it in real time. CGI had advanced so far beyond Jurassic Park that fantasy no longer felt like a fantasy. It felt normal. Adolescence didn't just happen anymore, hidden behind cracking voices and acne-laden faces. It was documented, shared, reacted to. Gen Z didn't transition into a digital world, they were handed one. When 13 means you're the creator and nothing is real. Now, Gen Alpha is turning 13 this year. Their grandparents were playing in arcades at their age. Their parents were surfing the web and creating content or updating their Facebook status with the latest movie they saw in theaters with friends. Their older siblings are doom scrolling in their rooms, often alone. Now, Gen Alpha doesn't just consume content, they don't just share it, they can create it. Not in the way earlier generations did, mastering software over time, building skills through friction, but instantly, with prompts, with voice, with a few words typed into a screen. And they are just now teenagers. 57% of US teens already use AI chatbots to search for information, and 54% to complete schoolwork. Nearly a third report daily use. What took entire studios to create a generation ago can now be generated on a smartphone by speaking it into existence. This is a monumental shift. No longer is there great anticipation of a movie coming out in a few months in theaters and then a year later on VHS available at Blockbuster. That is how we used to have to watch movies before streaming. Now anyone can create, and it's instant. A new movie doesn't solely debut in theaters, and if it does, it's weeks or months before you can stream it on the 6.7-inch screen in your pocket. What's more, school doesn't always get canceled for snow days, it moves online. Mental health days are becoming policy, not exception. In fact, schools are very quick to cancel in-person gatherings. Even yesterday, schools and universities closed due to the possible threat of severe weather and tornadoes. Their classes went online. The boundaries are shifting between learning and generating, between consuming and creating, between real and artificial, between fear and caution. For Gen Alpha, none of this feels new, it feels normal. And yet, what part of being able to create something out of nothing by just speaking a prompt to a machine is normal? The parents who raise them. If you only look at the kids, you miss half the story. Every generation is shaped not just by the world they grow up in, but by the people raising them. And those people have changed just as significantly as the technology surrounding them. In 1980, the average first-time mother was 22.7 years old. By the time the first Gen Z babies arrived in 1997, that number had risen to 24.7. By 2013, that number reached 26, with the overall average age of all mothers at birth climbing to 28.2. 3 years of shift across a generation doesn't sound dramatic until you consider what those years represent. More time in the workforce, more post-secondary education, more life experience before the first child arrives. Gen Alpha is being raised by older, more established parents than any prior cohort. The structure of those households shifted too. Births to unmarried women rose from 18.4% in 1980 to 32.4% in 1997 to 40.6% in 2013. But that number is more nuanced than it first appears. By the early 2010s, the majority of non-marital births were to cohabitating couples, not to single parents. In the 2009 to 2013 period, 25% of births were to cohabitating mothers, while 18% were to single mothers, meaning cohabitating births made up the majority of non-marital births. Two-parent households didn't disappear, marriage just stopped being the default container for them. And then there is the technology context these parents were already living inside when their children were born. In June 2013, Pew Research Center reported that 56% of US adults owned a smartphone, the first time they'd ever measured a majority. Home broadband was in 70% of households. Social media was normalized across adult life, not just among teenagers. And the parents of Gen Alpha didn't introduce their children to smartphones. They were already living inside of them. Time use research shows that today's parents, millennial parents especially, spend more hours in active childcare than parents of previous generations. They're more involved, they're more intentional, more anxious too. A substantial share describe parenting as stressful and say they are raising the kids differently from how they were raised. The intensive parenting culture that emerged as a reaction to Gen X's latchkey upbringing has not subsided. For Gen Alpha, it arrived with a smartphone in hand. Born into international disruption. There's one more layer that is easy to underestimate. A child born in 2013 was around 6 or 7 years old when COVID-19 disrupted the world in March of 2020. Arguably, the impacts of COVID were felt more immediately and were more far-reaching throughout the entire planet than any recent technological advancement. Members of Gen Alpha are old enough to remember pieces of it. Schools changing, schedules changing, masks, even vaccines. Adults were figuring things out in real time. However, most of Gen Alpha is not old enough to fully understand what actually happened. Those years, kindergarten and first grade, are the moment school is supposed to become stable and routine and foundational. Instead, 77% of public schools and 73% of private schools moved to online learning nearly overnight. NAEP long-term trend data from 2022 recorded the largest declines in reading since 1990 and the first ever measured decline in math for 9-year-old children at the center of this cohort. For Gen Alpha, stability is not assumed the way it once was for prior generations. Adaptation is. The world changed on them at the exact moment they were learning that it was a reliable place. A marker, not a verdict. It is tempting to look at all of this and try to define a generation, but let us not be too quick to make hasty characterizations. That's not the point of this essay. Instead, this is an observation, a chance to use age 13 as a useful lens for understanding where we are and how we got there. Think about where you were at age 13. What were you doing? What gadget were you vying for? And now, juxtapose that with today's reality. The generational arc tells a clear story. The world of 1978 expected Gen Xers to go figure it out on their own. There was trust and respect. There was an expectation of responsibility. The world of 1993 was quietly opening a portal to another world. Kids were still expected to be responsible, but we did not know the impact of computers, the internet, or even 24-hour news cycles and the toll that might have on the millennial generation. The world of 2010 handed Gen Z a device. It was supposed to connect them to the world, open up new social avenues and friendships, and allow parents to keep a close watch and protect them. But that device did almost the exact opposite. The world of 2026 will generate whatever you ask for. And yet, some things have not moved at all. The hypothalamus is still doing its work. Mood swings and raging hormones and awkward encounters and dancing between being a kid and an adult and a body that is foreign to you are all a real experience that all 13-year-olds have endured and will endure for all time. The questions are still the same ones every generation has faced. Who am I? Where do I belong? And what do I believe? However, the environment surrounding those questions has shifted again. Thank you for listening to this reading of Clyde. Until next time, I'm Ryan.
The Ryan Vet Show. Be sure to subscribe, comment, and like this episode. Plus, share it with someone who needs to hear it.